Hi, this is Don Farber with VineyardSoft Corporation, and I'd like to welcome you to this second of a two-part training course on the design of aggregate queries in the KnowledgeSync solution. We recommend that you have previously listened to Part 1 on the design of aggregate queries, as well as the 6-part training course on the basics of query designing. For today's session, we're going to look at designing a query that counts the number of overdue invoices per vendor and checks to see if that count is greater than a certain number. So we're going to begin by clicking on our new query definition button to begin the design of this query. Let's call this AP more than X invoices. Well, we'll call it overdue invoices per vendor. So we've got our description. Now let's proceed with designing this query. As in all queries, we're going to start out by choosing the tables from which we wish to retrieve data. AP invoices are stored in the table called Open Invoice, and since we'll want to know the name of the vendors, we're also going to retrieve information from our vendor master table. Having chosen our two tables, let's next proceed with linking them. Our primary table for this query is the invoice table, and that links to the vendor master table using a field called vendor number. Now we can begin choosing the columns or fields for this query. As in the aggregate query we designed earlier, this count query is not going to retrieve data from many query columns because we want the results of this query to show us those vendors that have more than a certain number of overdue invoices. As in any aggregate query, the first column that we should choose should be the field that we're performing the aggregate function on. In this case, we want to count the number of invoices. When we're using the count function, you will typically choose the unique ID or primary key of a record within a certain table. In this case, we're going to be looking at our open invoice table. We are counting the number of invoices, and the primary key to the invoice table is in fact the invoice number. So we're going to start our count aggregate query by choosing the invoice number field, and we're going to change the column type from normal to count. Now at this point, if we hit our preview tab, what we'd see is a total number of all of the invoices in our system. And in fact, there are 91 of them. But we need a little bit more detail than that, so let's go back to our Columns tab. For one thing, we're going to be counting the number of invoices, so let's change our customized name to invoice_count. And we want to count the number of invoices by vendor, so let's scroll back to our vendor table, and let's choose our vendor name field. Now if we hit preview, we're now seeing the number of invoices per vendor, getting close to our desired results. Now, since we might want to notify the vendor about a particular condition, i.e. the overdue invoices, we might also wish to choose the vendor's email address, and so we'll add that as one more column to this query. And I think at this point, we're ready to go and start specifying the criteria under which we want this query to retrieve and count records. Well, for one thing, we only want to look at those invoices that are overdue for payment. So we'll go to our Filters tab, scroll down to our Invoice table, and we want to look for the invoice due date. And we want to look at only those invoices that are overdue, meaning that the due date is in the past. So we'll say that the invoice due date is less than, and here we'll choose a date substitution variable for the current date. Once again, the accounting system that I'm using stores its dates in YYYY-MM-DD format. So the invoice due date is in the past, meaning that the invoice is overdue. And we probably also want to specify that the invoice balance is greater than 0 because we only care about those invoices that have not been paid off. So let's scroll down until we find our invoice balance field. There it is. Invoice balance is greater than 0. All right, so now we should get a count of overdue invoices per vendor. Let's see what our results look like. Okay, we can see a few of the email addresses for these vendors. We can see that Airway Property has 4 overdue invoices. One more step that we need to take in the design of this query. We want to retrieve only those vendors for whom there are more than a certain number of overdue invoices. That's the greater than X in our description of the query. So when we want to perform a test on the aggregate result, i.e. we want to test the count of invoices, once again, that's a sub-filter. So we're going to say that the count of overdue invoices is greater than a certain number. And we'll leave this as a parameter-driven filter. So we'll leave a question mark in the compare value, go to the optional prompt and say more than how many overdue invoices. And let's give this query one final test. Let's say more than 3 overdue invoices, because I know that Airway Property has 4. And in fact, Airway Property and Anders Auto Repair both have 4 overdue invoices. I'm now done with this query and can save and close it. But I'm going to put one more component into this query because although it's nice to know how many overdue invoices each vendor has, it would be also nice to know what's the actual dollar total or the amount, the cumulative amount of those 4 invoices. So let's go back to our Columns tab. For one thing, I want to change this customized name from Invoice Count to Invoice Count Overdue. I want to remind myself that count is just those invoices that are overdue. And you know, I'd really like to total the balance of those invoices. So let's go back to our invoice table. And let's look again for that invoice balance field. And here I'm actually going to do another aggregate function. I now want to total all of those overdue invoices per vendor. So we're going to call this field balance underscore overdue. We're specifying a type of summarize. And now let's look at our results. We'll say more than 3 overdue invoices. And so now this is a very useful query. My count of overdue invoices, as we can see, is 4 for those 2 vendors, one of whom we have an email address, but perhaps most valuable is the balance overdue. In the case of Airway Property, some $31,000 worth of overdue invoices, and for Anders Auto Repair, just over $3,600. So I'm going to hit Save and Close now, and that wraps up this training session on the creation of aggregate queries, in this case using the count function, but also please do note that when you design an aggregate query, you can in fact use multiple aggregate functions within the same query. So let's save and close this query, which returns us to our main Event Manager window, and that wraps up this second of 2 training courses on the creation of aggregate queries in the KnowledgeSync solution. Thank you very much for spending your time with me to go over the creation of aggregate queries, and we look forward to speaking with you in a future KnowledgeSync training session. Thanks very much.